In today's project, we're going to be working on a repair, but I'll also be showing you how to work with silicone and resin with creating a silicone mold and casting a statue out of resin, or in this case, a statue part. This is the 1/4 scale NieR Automata by SQUARE ENIX in conjunction with Prime 1 Studio. So as mentioned in today's video, we will be recasting a statue part, and with that said, let me just say I do not approve of recasting statues. That's not what today's video is here for, although the process would be very similar to what I'm about to show you. We are not recasting an entire statue, but we will be recasting a statue part. But first, let me give you a little backstory as to why we're doing what we're doing. So a fellow collector reached out to me last year in need of a repair for this 1/4 scale NieR Automata statue. However, he did not have the piece that broke off. So basically we have this katana blade with a missing handle. The handle broke off and somehow went missing. He reached out to me asking if I could fix it. So now this is something I could fix by sculpting a new piece. But when looking at the katana handle, I noticed there was a lot of intricate details, especially with the ornate design on the bottom of the handle. You know, when it comes to statue designs these days, now that we have 3D software for sculpting, it's not the same as years ago to when statues were traditionally sculpted with clay by hand. Statues these days have a lot more details and a lot more textures because they're sculpted with 3D software. So trying to replicate that broken handle wasn't something I thought would be possible or would look good in the final outcome. But at the same time, I like to help people. I don't like seeing statues broken, and I always try my best to help a fellow collector as much as possible if I can. So I took a look at the images of the statue online, and I noticed that it was a diorama. There's multiple characters on the base. And one of the characters just so happens to have the same katana blade in their hand, but it's in a different color. So basically the plan for this project and this repair is I need to first replicate the broken missing statue part before I could even begin the repair. Luckily, this statue had another character who was holding the same exact weapon. Otherwise, this repair wouldn't be possible, or other than me trying to borrow another part from another collector, which definitely wouldn't have happened. Now, while the other character's weapon is a different color, it's black and gold, the colors really don't matter because once I've replicated it out of resin, the resin is white, and I'm just going to paint it anyway. The one that's broken and missing is going to be silver, black, and white. So once I'm able to duplicate the handle, that's all I need. And then I can just color match the colors to the factory and properly fix the statue. So the first step will be preparing the silicone. This particular silicone is used for mold making, and it has a 1-to-1 mix ratio, meaning you do not need any scale. You mix equal parts from each container, and then once poured together and mixed, you have 30 minutes working time, and then the silicone fully cures in 4 hours. Silicone is very expensive, so you don't want to use more than you have to. You want to find a container that is slightly larger than the object that you're going to be making a mold of. So in this case, I'm using an empty Gatorade plastic bottle. And you also want to make sure that your object is suspended in midair, not touching any of the sides of the container. This way you capture the entire project all around. I'm noticing that it's going to be difficult to cast the katana handle with the feather still attached. Once the silicone gets poured around this, it's going to be very difficult to try to pull it back out. So for that reason, unfortunately, I'm going to have to remove the feather tassel, and I'll be casting both pieces separately. So I'll make a silicone mold of the feather tassel by itself, and I'll make a silicone mold of the katana handle by itself, and then I'll reattach them at the end when I'm doing the repair work. I need to make sure I get this right the first time because, as mentioned, silicone is expensive and you definitely don't want to mess up and have to do this over again. So I'm running some test fits, and for the feather tassel, I'm adding a spout to the top so it'll be easier for me to pour the resin later on. And then for the katana blade, it actually rests nice and flat on top of the plastic bottle. So I'll be able to pour the silicone into the bottle right up to the top of the handle and capture all of the details. And I'm just using some plastic clips to hold each item into place because, again, as mentioned, you want them to be suspended in the air. This way the silicone has a chance to fully surround the entire object. This way you get every single detail from every single angle. The silicone should be safe against the paint and not cause any damage, but just in case, I don't want to take any chances, so I did wrap the arm with some plastic and tape. This way it doesn't make any contact with the silicone when being poured. After the silicone fully cures in 4 hours, you're going to need to be able to pull the part back out of the mold. So one trick is to rub a little bit of Vaseline on the object. This way it's easier to remove the silicone mold. The handle will be done slightly different than the feather tassel because the handle still has the arm attached to it. So when it comes time to release the part from the silicone, I'll be able to pull it out of the mold by the arm. But for the feather tassel, I don't have that option because the feather tassel, I need to fully immerse it into the silicone. This way I get a mold of the entire tassel. So for that casting, I'll be doing it slightly different, which I'll show you coming up. Okay, so here's a look at the two parts that I'll be making duplicate copies of. Each one is suspended freely inside of the Gatorade bottle, and then I also have a plastic container on the outside of the bottle, just in case there's any spill when pouring the silicone. So now this is a two-part silicone mix, meaning you're going to mix two equal parts. It comes in two separate containers, and I'll be pouring equal amounts into their own separate containers, and then eventually pouring them together into another larger container. When it's time to mix it all together, you have roughly 30 minutes working time, so that's plenty of time to make sure everything looks correct. And this specific silicone is listed as self-degassing, meaning you do not need a pressure chamber to remove any bubbles that might form. Normally, when working with silicone, as you're pouring it, you might create some bubbles within the mix, which can cause air pockets around the object. And you could possibly not capture every detail, or even worse, you could create an air pocket and not capture the object at all. So most professionals would work with a pressure chamber, which basically sucks the air out of the container. This way there's no air bubbles within the mixture. But for this project and for this silicone, we're going to be working without an air chamber, and hopefully we don't get too many air bubbles if poured correctly. Before pouring the silicone, you want to make sure you shake each bottle extremely well for a few minutes. This way everything is mixed correctly. And then when mixing the two bottles together, you want to make sure you thoroughly stir the entire mixture very well. It's extremely important that everything is mixed correctly at equal amounts and it is stirred correctly. If not, you could possibly cause the silicone to not cure correctly. Also, the mixture is hazardous, so you want to make sure you have the proper protection. Make sure you're wearing gloves as well as protective eyewear in case of any splashes. And avoid getting the stuff on your skin. So the first pour that we'll be doing will be the feather tassel, and as I pour the mixture into the container, I'm doing something called a high pour. It's when you pour the mixture from a very tall height, and this is a great tip to make sure that there's no air bubbles within the mixture. As you pour it from high above, it gives the silicone a chance to fully settle without creating any air bubbles. You also want to make sure you pour it very slowly. Silicone has the consistency of a thick gel, so you want to go very slowly to make sure it fully has time to settle around the entire object. Otherwise, you risk the chance of air pockets. And then I already previously mixed up another batch, this time for the katana blade, and the same thing, you want to do a nice slow high pour to make sure it fully settles around the object and that you do not create any air bubbles. Once you have everything poured around your objects, you want to let it sit for 4 hours, or in my case, I'm going to let it sit overnight because I'm not in any rush to finish this project all in one day. So the next day, here's how the silicone looks when it's all dried up. Everything cured perfectly. It has that nice jello squishy consistency, and now we can remove the two objects from the mold. So there's two ways to release the object from the mold. One would be to cut it out with an X-Acto knife, or the other method would be just to pull it out with force, which in this case for the katana handle, because it's a straight object, I'll be able to just lift it out of the silicone mold. From the previous step, the Vaseline helps the silicone from sticking to the object, and it also makes it easier to pull when you need to release it. Silicone in general is very stretchy, so it's not too difficult to remove, but you do want to be careful that you do not tear any part of the rubber mold. Okay, so I was able to release the katana blade without cutting through the mold, and here's how that's looking. There was no damage to the paint. I just need to clean up the Vaseline, and here's a look at our rubber mold. Judging by the outside of it, it did a great job of capturing the details of the bottle. So the inside mold of the handle should be very good at capturing all of the details when we pour the resin. Next, we'll be removing the feather tassel from its rubber mold, and this time it's going to be done a little bit differently because I had to submerge the entire object. So there's nothing for me to lift and grab it out of the mold from. I'll have to cut into it with an X-Acto blade. So the trick for doing that is you want to cut through the mold up until the object and then create a crisscross pattern when slicing it open. It's a very good trick to make sure that the rubber mold will close back together at the correct spots when it comes time to pour in the resin. When it comes time to pour the resin, we're going to push this back together. So you want to make sure that everything lines up correctly. And by creating this zigzag pattern, this will ensure that everything lines up correctly versus if you just cut a straight line through the mold. You don't need to cut all the way down the entire mold if you don't have to, but you do need to cut enough to where you're able to yank the part you casted back out of the mold. Okay, so now that we casted a mold of the two objects that we're trying to duplicate, we can now move on to pouring the resin into the mold. This way we actually have a physical object, which in this case will be a duplicate feather tassel and a duplicate handle for the katana blade. I'm using a 2-part polyurethane casting resin. It's very similar to the silicone with the mixture. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Your work time is only 2.5 minutes, so you need to work extremely fast, but your cure time is 10 to 15 minutes. So this is an extremely quick curing resin and really not recommended for someone that is not experienced with pouring resin. If you're not experienced with pouring resin and this is your first time, I recommend using something that cures more slowly. This way you have more time to work, and this way you have more time to make any adjustments in case something goes wrong. So again, here's our look at the two silicone molds that we'll be using. One is completely solid with no cut going through it. However, we had to cut open the other one with a zigzag pattern. I'm just going to simply use a rubber band to go around and hold it back together. The silicone mold does a great job at sealing back together, so you don't need anything too tight of a fit to close it. But a rubber band is more than enough to keep it closed and from any resin spilling out through the cracks. So I have my small little funnel when it comes time for pouring the resin onto the feather tassel, just so I have a little extra space. And then the mold of the handle, the opening is big enough that I'll just be able to pour the resin directly into it. And once again, this is also extremely hazardous. You want to make sure you're working in a well ventilated room and that you have proper equipment such as gloves, safety glasses, and make sure you have enough mixing dishes as well as mixing sticks. Give the resin a really good shake for a few minutes to make sure it's properly mixed and there's no settling, and then set it off to the side for a few minutes. This way it releases all of the bubbles from the mixture. It's a two-part casting resin, so we're going to be mixing equal amounts. So I'll be pouring equal amounts into their own separate containers, and then we'll mix the two together in one larger container. Once the two parts are mixed together, I have 2.5 minutes working time, which isn't much, so I'll need to work very quickly. One part of the mixture is clear and the other part of the mixture is brown in their liquid form. It has a brownish tint to the mixture, but when it fully cures, it'll cure white. When stirring the two batches together, you want to make sure you're mixing it extremely well, otherwise it may not cure properly. So starting off with the mold for the handle, I'm just going to pour this straight into the hole. It shouldn't take much resin. It's not a very large part. And I'm just going to do a very nice slow pour. This way it has time to settle and really capture each detail. And after a few minutes, here's how it's looking. It's now fully cured. It's now a white color, and we can now remove the parts. Starting with the feather tassel, since it's already cut open, I'll easily be able to just pull it straight out of the mold. And then for the katana handle, since that one hasn't been sliced open yet, I'll be going around just doing the same zigzag pattern in case I want to reuse the silicone mold for more parts. And here's how it's looking. The silicone and the resin did a great job at capturing all of the details within the katana blade handle. It has all of the wrappings around the handle as well as the ornate design. So definitely really great materials for capturing details with this specific brand of silicone and resin. Compared to the real part, everything looks great, and we have a successful casting of the statue part. So now we can move on to the repair part, which will be restoring the handle back onto the original arm holding the katana blade. I cut the resin handle exactly where I thought it would have broken off the statue. It looks like it was a clean break, so it wasn't too difficult to match up each part, and to make sure each one has good structural strength when gluing the two halves together, I drilled a hole through both ends. This way I can run a metal rod in between the two parts for extra strength. Up next, we'll be gluing the two parts together, and for that, I use what I always use for all of my repair projects. It's the JB Weld 2-part epoxy, and similar to everything else that we've been mixing throughout this video, it's a 2-part mixture of equal halves. This particular 2-part epoxy has a working time of 6 minutes, and then it fully cures within 4 hours. So here's how it's looking once it had time to fully cure and dry, and we have successfully made a broken statue part and successfully repaired it back together. So from here on out, all I really need to do is move on to the paint. Here's a look at the feather tassel once it was released from the silicone mold. So now the tassel didn't do as good of a job as the handle with capturing all of the details. So I did need to do some work to the tassel as far as restoring some of the details with some sculpting clay. So as of right now, it's looking a little rough, but once it's sanded and primed and painted, it will look fine. Also, because the original feather tassel was made from a flexible rubber material, and now my casted feather tassel is a hard plastic resin, I need to reattach it a little bit differently than how the factory handle was attached. They originally made the feather tassel very flexible and rubbery. This way it wouldn't break. So I don't feel comfortable gluing it back onto the handle, as I feel it'll just break right back off. So what I did was I ran a little bit of metal wire in a ring circle, and then I'm going to run the metal wire into the casted feather tassel. This way the wire allows the tassel to have a little bit of movement, creating that flexibility between the two parts. And once everything was reattached, here's how it's looking. So from this point, we can move on to primer and then on to paint. I wrapped up the arm with some plastic wrap and some Tamiya tape to protect the arm from any overspray. I also did a little work with sculpting clay right where the break was to hide any of the seam lines. And I also sculpted over the ring on the bottom of the handle. This way the metal wire is now concealed. So the next step will be to prime this, and I'm using some surface primer sprayed through an airbrush gun. And here's how it's looking. After being primed, everything is looking good. It looks like it was never broken, and we can now move on to the paint. As for the paint, I'm just matching it to what the factory did. So the handle is a silver/gray color, and then we have the black diamond pattern that runs down the handle. And for the tip of the handle, the ornate design will be painted with an aluminum metal color. And then for the feather tassel, that'll just be white to an off-white color. And here's a look at the final result. We have the black katana blade that was used to make the silicone mold, and we have the now repaired silver katana handle, all restored and looking good as new. This was definitely a challenging repair project, but at the same time, it was a lot of fun. and I'm happy that I was able to help the collector fix his statue, and he'll be able to display it again proudly. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. There's tons of cool projects on the way, so definitely hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next project. Take care.